The letter had been in his pocket for 47 days. Grady Marsh knew this without counting because he had stopped counting somewhere around day 12 and then found himself counting again on day 30 and then stopped again because the counting didn't do anything except confirm that time was moving and Robert wasn't moving with it. 47 days since the telegram. 47 days since his mother had made a sound in the kitchen that Grady had never heard a human being make before and hoped never to hear again. 47 days since the world had divided itself cleanly into before and after, and Grady had found himself standing on the wrong side of that line with no clear understanding of how he'd gotten there. He kept the letter in the left breast pocket of his uniform jacket. Not the right, the left over the heart, which he understood was sentimental in a way that Robert would have given him grief about if Robert were here to give him grief about anything. But Robert wasn't here. That was the whole problem. That was the only problem. And everything else, every morning formation and mess hall inspection and perimeter check at Camp Harlow, Kansas, was just the machinery of days moving forward, whether Grady wanted them to or not. He buttoned the pocket each morning before anything else, before his boots, before his belt. The letter first buttoned in, and then the rest of the day could begin. May 8th, 1945 began like every other day at Camp Harlow, which meant it began in the dark. 4:30 in the morning, the Kansas sky still holding on to night with the particular stubbornness of early spring when the cold hadn't finished with you, but the darkness was already starting to thin at the edges. Grady was dressed and outside before the 5 o'clock assembly call because he had not slept well, which was not unusual, and because the alternative to being outside was lying on his bunk, staring at the wooden planks above him, counting the knots in the grain, which he had memorized weeks ago, and which offered nothing new. Camp Harlow held 380 German prisoners of war. It was not what most people imagined when they imagined a prisoner of war camp, which Grady had learned from the letters he'd gotten from his cousin Franklin in Georgia, who had written asking whether it was true they kept the Germans in cages. It was not cages. It was wooden barracks in 10 long rows on flat Kansas land, surrounded by 2 fences with wire between them and guard towers at the corners, and a perimeter road that Grady had walked so many times he could do it in his sleep and sometimes thought he was. The men inside the wire had beds. They had a recreation yard. They had work details that took them to farms and canning plants in the surrounding county where they picked crops and processed food and were paid a small wage in camp currency that could be spent at the canteen on cigarettes and soap. It was, by the standards of what Grady knew was happening on the other side of the world, almost comfortable. This bothered him in ways he couldn't organize into coherent thought. Not because he wanted the men inside the wire to suffer. He didn't think he wanted that. He didn't think he was that kind of person. But Robert had died in mud somewhere outside Cologne, which Grady knew from the official communication and the less official letter that had come from Robert's sergeant 3 weeks later, describing in careful language the kind of thing that sergeants were not supposed to put in letters, but sometimes did anyway because they understood that families needed more than official language. Robert had died in mud outside Cologne on the 22nd of March, and the men inside the wire at Camp Harlow had not, and this disparity sat in Grady's chest like something that hadn't finished settling yet. He was not a hateful person. He wanted to be clear about this, at least to himself, in the private accounting that happened on the perimeter road at 4:30 in the morning when there was no one else around to perform anything for. He did not hate the men inside the wire as individuals. He didn't know them as individuals. What he felt was something more diffuse and more difficult, a kind of low ambient grievance with the shape of the world, with a specific arrangement of fate that had put Robert in mud outside Cologne and put these men behind comfortable wire in Kansas, and put Grady himself in the worst possible position, which was the position of someone who had not been in either place. He had requested the transfer himself. That was the part he lived with most heavily. Not the transfer itself, which his mother had asked for, with the particular directness of a woman who had already lost a husband to the last war and was not going to surrender a second man to this one if there was any administrative mechanism available to prevent it. She had written a letter. She had written it to the right people. And 3 weeks later, Grady had received orders reassigning him from his infantry unit to the Prisoner of War Administration Corps, which was the Army's polite way of saying that he would spend the remainder of the war in Kansas making sure German prisoners ate their meals and made their bed checks and did not escape into the surrounding farmland. He had agreed to it. He told himself he'd agreed because refusing would have broken something in his mother that was already fragile. He told himself this on the good days. On the other days, he didn't tell himself anything, just kept walking the perimeter road in the dark and buttoned the pocket with the letter in it and waited for a feeling of resolution that kept not arriving. The morning assembly passed without incident. 380 men in the recreation yard at 6 counted, confirmed dismissed, back to barracks. Grady stood at the edge of the yard with his rifle on his shoulder and watched them move. He was not looking for anything specific. He was doing what he had trained himself to do, which was to observe without engagement, to be present without being involved, to maintain the careful professional distance that the handbook suggested, and that the older guards like Sergeant Walsh had perfected into something that looked almost like not seeing the men at all. Grady had not perfected it. He still saw them. He saw the man in the third row who walked with a slight lean to the left, which Grady had observed for 2 weeks and which he had not reported, because it seemed like a private thing, the kind of physical fact a man carried without wanting it noticed. He saw the young one, no older than 19 or 20, who always positioned himself near the back of the group and always looked at the ground during assembly with the practiced invisibility of someone who had learned that being overlooked was safer than being seen. He saw the older man somewhere in his 50s, who stood at assembly with his back straight and his hands at his sides in a way that was not military compliance, but something more internal, a self-discipline that had nothing to do with the guards watching him and everything to do with the standard he was maintaining for reasons that had nothing to do with Camp Harlow. Grady had noticed this older man for weeks without knowing why he kept noticing him. There was nothing remarkable about him in the way that remarkable things were usually remarkable. He was not tall, he did not cause trouble, he did not seek attention in either direction, neither the defiant trouble-seeking of some prisoners, nor the anxious compliance-seeking of others. He simply existed in the yard with a quality of self-possession that seemed to take up more space than the man himself occupied. His name Grady had checked was Heinrich Vogel, 54 years old, captured in the autumn of 1944 in northern France. Occupation listed as physician. The mess hall opened at 7. This was the first meal of the day, and by the standards of what Grady understood to be reasonable nutrition, it was adequate without being generous. Porridge, bread, coffee that had been made from whatever the Army procurement system provided, which varied in quality week to week in ways that Grady had stopped trying to predict. The prisoners moved through the serving line in the organized way that 380 men moving through a serving line had to move if 380 men were going to eat before the morning work details began. Grady stood at the east wall. His post during meals was the east wall, which gave him a full line of sight across the room, in which he had come to know, the way you come to know any space you spend significant time in the particular way. The morning light came through the windows on the south side and made columns on the floor. The table in the far corner, where the same 6 men sat every morning without apparent discussion or arrangement. The spot near the serving line where the floorboard had a soft place that made a different sound when stepped on, which Grady had learned to use as an auditory marker when his attention drifted. He was watching without watching, the way he'd learned when he saw Heinrich Vogel do something that should not have caught his attention as completely as it did. Vogel had taken his tray through the line and carried it to his usual table. He sat down. He arranged the items on his tray with the methodical precision that Grady had observed before, not fussy, just deliberate. A man who organized his small space because organizing the small space was within his control, and he intended to exercise that control completely. Then Vogel looked across the table. Across the table in the corner seat was a young prisoner. Grady estimated his age at 20, possibly younger, though it was hard to know with certainty, because the young ones who'd been in the camp longest had a quality to their faces that made age assessment difficult. This one had been brought in on a cold morning in November in a group transfer from a camp in Texas, and since then he had occupied the corner seat at Vogel's table and had said, as far as Grady could observe, almost nothing to anyone. The young prisoner had his tray in front of him. He was not eating. He was sitting with his hands in his lap and looking at the table surface with the particular vacancy of someone who was not present in the room they were physically occupying. Vogel looked at him for a moment. Then, with a motion so unhurried it might have been accidental, Vogel transferred a portion of his bread from his own tray to the young prisoners. He did it without looking up, without making a gesture of generosity, without any of the physical signals that a person makes when they want the act of giving to be seen and acknowledged. He simply moved his hand, placed the bread on the other tray, and returned to arranging his own breakfast. The young prisoner looked down at the bread. He did not look at Vogel. He did not say anything. He picked up the bread after a moment and held it with both hands, and something in the way he held it made Grady look away, because it felt like witnessing something that was not meant to be witnessed. Something too private for the east wall of a mess hall in Kansas. Grady looked at the south windows, at the light columns on the floor, at the soft spot in the floorboard near the serving line. He did not write the observation in his duty log. He was not sure why. The regulation did not specifically prohibit one prisoner sharing food with another, so there was no dereliction in not reporting it. This was what he told himself. It had nothing to do with the fact that writing it down would have required him to look at it directly to make it a documented fact in the official record of the day, when what he needed it to be was something he could choose not to have seen. He understood, even as he was doing it, that this was not a particularly defensible position. Chet Waverly appeared at his elbow at 7:45 with the specific energy that Chet Waverly brought to every moment of every day, which was the energy of a man who processed the world by talking about it continuously. "Rotation in 20, Chet said. You eat yet? Not yet. They've got eggs this morning. Real ones, not the powder." Grady looked at him. Chet shrugged. "Henderson's wife sent a case from their farm. Captain authorized them for the guard mess. Real eggs." Grady looked back at the room, at the 380 men eating porridge and bread and thin coffee. "I'll eat later," he said. Chet Waverly was 26 years old and had been at Camp Harlow for 14 months, which made him the longest-serving guard currently assigned to Grady's rotation, and which gave him a settled quality that Grady sometimes envied and sometimes found irritating, depending on the day. He was not unkind. He was not stupid. He simply existed at Camp Harlow with the equanimity of a man who had decided that the war was happening somewhere else, and his job was to make sure the fence held, and this decision had apparently worked out fine for him. He was also the primary source of institutional information that Grady had, since Chet knew everything that happened at Camp Harlow approximately 40 minutes before anyone else, because he was the kind of person that other people told things to without quite deciding to. At 8:15, the morning work details departed. 210 prisoners loaded onto trucks for the farm work and the canning plant rotation. The remaining 170 stayed in camp for maintenance details and recreational time. Grady transitioned from the mess hall to the perimeter road for the 9 o'clock walk, which he did alone, because he preferred it alone and because Chet, who usually partnered with him, had been pulled for a supply inventory that the administrative office ran on alternating Tuesdays. The perimeter road was 1 mile around the full circumference of Camp Harlow's inner fence. Grady walked it slowly. The morning had warmed into something almost pleasant, the Kansas spring, doing its irregular best, a light wind from the west, carrying the smell of the fields that surrounded the camp on three sides. In other circumstances, it would have been a good morning. The kind of morning that Robert would have described as baseball weather, a phrase he used for any morning that felt like possibility rather than obligation. Grady did not let himself finish the thought. He was on his second circuit of the perimeter when the orderly from the administrative building appeared at the main gate and asked him to report to Captain Gaines's office when his rotation completed. Grady completed the circuit, checked in with the gate sergeant, and walked across the compound to the low building near the entrance that served as Camp Harlow's administrative center. Captain Harlan Gaines's office was a room that had been furnished by someone who understood function but had no particular relationship with comfort. A desk, 2 chairs for visitors, a filing cabinet, a window that looked out onto the compound's central yard, which meant that Gaines, when he was at his desk, could see approximately 40% of the camp's activity without standing up, which Grady had come to understand was not an accident. Gaines was 59 years old. He had the face of a man who had been outside in weather for most of his adult life, which was accurate because he had spent 30 years in the Army, and the Army had put him outside in weather for most of it. He was not physically large, but he occupied his space with the density of someone who had decided a long time ago exactly what he was, and had not spent subsequent energy revising the decision. Chet Waverly was already in the office when Grady arrived, which meant the summons had been for both of them, which meant something administrative. Chet gave Grady the brief look that meant he didn't know what this was about either. "Gentleman," Gaines said without preamble, which was his style, "tonight's evening meal will be different." He did not elaborate immediately. He let that sit for a moment, in the way that men with authority sometimes let statements sit, to observe what the room does with them. Chet said, "Different house, sir." Gaines folded his hands on the desk. "Meat, vegetables, real bread, sufficient portions for all 380 prisoners in the full guard contingent." Grady waited for the explanation. It did not come. Sir Chet said, "That's what's the occasion. Is this an inspection thing? Is there someone coming from the regional office?" "No inspection," Gaines said. Is there a reason, sir, for tonight specifically?" Gaines looked at Chet for a moment with the expression of a man who is deciding how much of an answer constitutes a sufficient answer. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said. "Tonight." He said it in a way that did not invite follow-up questions, which was also his style. They were dismissed. Grady walked out of the administrative building into the May morning and stopped on the step for a moment, orienting himself to the information. Chet came out behind him and kept walking, already processing the news in the only way Chet processed anything, which was verbally. "Meat," Chet said. "You know what that's going to cost? For 380 men, that's not coming out of the standard allocation. I looked at the mess budget last month when Henderson asked me to, and there is no line item for this kind of—" He gestured vaguely at the air hospitality. Grady started walking. "Maybe he got authorization from regional," Grady said. "Maybe," Chet said, "but he said no inspection. He said no one's coming. So why would regional authorize a special meal if no one's coming to see it?" Grady didn't answer. He walked toward the East Barracks, and Chet peeled off toward the motor pool, and the morning continued in its ordinary way. Except, at 10:40, Grady was crossing the northern edge of the compound near the administrative building when he heard Gaines's voice through the open window. Not the words at first, just the tone, which was different from the tone Gaines used in the office or on the compound, more constrained, the voice of a man choosing each word with particular attention. Grady slowed without deciding to slow. The window was cranked open 3 inches, enough for the voice to carry into the still morning air. Gaines was on the telephone. Grady caught fragments. The name of someone in the regional office in Topeka, a colonel, he thought. Something about a communication. Something about timing. And then clearly in Gaines's most deliberate voice, the voice he used when he was saying something he intended to be understood precisely. "Not yet. Let me do this first." And then the call ended. Grady heard the receiver set down. He had stopped walking without meaning to and was standing at the edge of the administrative building's shadow on the compound gravel, and he started walking again before anyone could observe that he had stopped. "Not yet. Let me do this first." He turned the words over as he walked. They did not produce a clear meaning. They produced a shape, the outline of something he didn't have enough information to identify. Gaines had received some kind of communication that he was choosing to delay acting on. He was delaying it until after the evening meal, until after 380 prisoners had eaten real food for the first time in however long it had been. Grady thought about this and arrived at no conclusions, and filed it in the part of his mind where he put things he hadn't finished understanding yet. The afternoon moved slowly in the way that afternoons at Camp Harlow moved slowly, which was the specific slowness of a place where time was being served rather than spent. Grady walked his assignments. He filled out his portion of the duty log with the careful attention to procedure that the training had emphasized and that he had genuinely internalized, because attention to procedure was one of the things that kept the day organized enough to be functional. He thought about the letter in his left breast pocket. He did not take it out. He had not taken it out since the day he'd received it, which had been April 14th, which was not that he was counting 24 days after Robert died. His mother had forwarded it from the last address Robert had for Grady, the infantry unit address before the transfer, which meant it had taken 3 weeks to route correctly, 3 weeks of sitting in some mailbag moving through the Army's postal system, while Grady was already in Kansas not knowing it was coming. Robert had written it on March 19th, 3 days before he died. Grady knew this because the postmark was March 19th, and the death was March 22nd, and the mathematics were simple and terrible. Robert had written him a letter 3 days before he died. Grady had received it 24 days after and had read it once on the afternoon it arrived, sitting on his bunk in the guard quarters with the door closed, and had not been able to read it again since. What he remembered was the tone of it, not anxious, not dramatic. Robert had never been dramatic. It was the tone of a man writing to his brother from a place that he understood clearly and did not intend to misrepresent. It said some things about the countryside that Grady had found hard to read. It said something about the cold. It said, near the end, something that Grady had returned to without being able to look at directly, that Robert had been thinking about what things were worth out there, what things actually mattered when everything was simplified down to essential questions, and that he had arrived at some conclusions that he wanted to tell Grady about in person when he got back over whatever the approximation of a decent meal was going to look like in the first weeks of peacetime. In person, when he got back. Grady pressed his palm against the left breast pocket briefly, a gesture he made without thinking about it, and kept walking. He was crossing the south edge of the recreation yard at 3:40 when he saw Heinrich Vogel sitting alone on one of the wooden benches near the fence, not in the sun, which was where most of the prisoners chose to be when they had outdoor recreation time, but in the thin shade of the fence post, which offered almost no shade at all, and which was therefore an unusual choice unless shade was not the point. Vogel was not reading, he was not talking to anyone. He was sitting with his hands on his knees, looking at the middle distance, with the expression of a man engaged in some internal conversation that had been going on for a long time and had not yet reached its conclusion. Grady watched him from across the yard for longer than was strictly necessary for surveillance purposes. He thought about the bread on the young prisoner's tray, the unhurried hand, the complete absence of performance. He thought about what it meant to do something good when no one was watching. Not because no one was watching, but simply because it was the thing to do regardless of audience. He thought about whether he would have noticed if Vogel had known he was being observed, whether the act would have looked different, whether there was a version of that gesture that was about being seen, and whether Vogel was capable of that version, or whether what he'd seen was the only version the man had. He moved on before Vogel turned to look in his direction. At 4:15, Chet found him again near the motor pool. "You hear the kitchen detail got pulled from the canning plant early," Chet said. "They've got something going on in the mess hall. I walked by and it smells like, it actually smells like food." He paused, like real food. The late afternoon sun was doing something particular to the Kansas sky, turning the flat horizon to the west into a strip of color that Grady noticed and then looked away from because it made him think of things he didn't want to think about. "Real food," Grady said. "Meat?" Chet confirmed. "I think it's actually beef. I haven't smelled beef cooking in, I don't know." He shook his head. "What do you think this is about, Marsh? Seriously, no inspection, no occasion. It's a Tuesday. What is Gaines doing?" Grady looked at the administrative building across the compound, at the window that was now closed, at the ordinary exterior of the thing that Gaines knew and wasn't saying yet. "I don't know," Grady said, "but I think we'll find out tonight." Chet looked at him with the expression of a man waiting for more. Grady didn't give him more. He went back to the duty log and the perimeter schedule and the ordinary machinery of the afternoon, carrying the not yet of Gaines's phone call in the same pocket as Robert's letter close to the chest, where the things he hadn't finished understanding lived until he was ready to open them. The kitchen detail worked until 5:30. By 5, the smell had reached the barracks. Grady knew this because he was on the east perimeter at 5 o'clock when the first work trucks came back through the main gate with the prisoners returning from the farm details, and he watched what happened when the smell reached the men stepping off the trucks. It was not a dramatic thing. It was barely visible. A pause, a slight change in how a man held his head, a second breath taken more slowly than the first. Not more than that. But it moved through the group of returning men like something passing through water, a ripple from a source that no one was acknowledging, because acknowledging it would have required feeling it, and feeling it was dangerous when you weren't sure yet whether it was real. Grady stood at the perimeter fence and watched, and felt something he didn't have a name for move through his own chest in the same way. The evening meal call was at 6. He had 45 minutes to finish his perimeter rotation file, his afternoon report, and take his position at the east wall of the mess hall. He used them. He did not take the letter out of his pocket. He buttoned it in and went back to work and told himself that whatever tonight was, he would understand it when it happened. He had been telling himself that about a lot of things lately. He was starting to wonder when the understanding was actually going to arrive. The line formed at 5:55, not because anyone told them to line up at 5:55. The evening meal call was 6 o'clock, and the procedure was that the mess hall doors opened at 6 and the prisoners entered in an organized sequence by barracks, which they had done every evening for as long as Camp Harlow had been operating, which meant the line should not have existed until the bell rang. but the smell had been building for 2 hours. By 5:30, it had moved through the recreation yard and along the gap between the East Barracks in the maintenance shed and into the spaces between buildings where the afternoon air collected and held things. By 5:45, it had reached the interior of the barracks themselves, coming through the ventilation gaps at the roofline, settling into the wood smell and the wool smell and the particular closed-air smell of a building where many men have lived for a long time in close proximity. By 5:50, it was the only thing in the compound that anyone was paying attention to, though no one was acknowledging this, because acknowledging it would have required answering the question of what it meant, and the answer to that question was not something any of them were ready to hold yet. Grady was at his post on the east wall at 5:52 when the first prisoners began to drift toward the mess hall entrance from the direction of the North Barracks. They did not hurry. That was the first thing he noticed. Men who had been waiting for something and then received confirmation that the thing was real did not always move toward it quickly. Sometimes they moved slowly with the specific caution of people who had learned that anticipation was its own kind of danger, that wanting something too openly created a vulnerability that the world had shown in various ways a willingness to exploit. These men moved slowly. They carried themselves with a careful neutrality, as if they had simply found themselves walking in this direction for no particular reason, and were mildly interested in what might be at the end of it. But they adjusted their grip on the metal trays. Grady watched this. He watched the way hands that had carried the same trays through the same line for months suddenly held them differently, not tighter exactly, but more deliberately, the way you hold something when you've been reminded that it has weight. He watched the way the line organized itself without instruction, the usual barracks sequence dissolving into something more organic, men from different buildings standing together without the normal social architecture of who stood where, as if the smell had temporarily suspended the small territorial rules that governed how 380 men shared a space. He watched a man near the middle of the line lean slightly to the right, trying to see past the shoulders in front of him. The man did not step forward to see better. He just tilted and then straightened and then stood with his eyes focused on some point ahead that he couldn't yet see clearly, and his jaw set in a way that might have been anticipation and might have been the effort of not showing anticipation. 6 o'clock, the bell, the doors, the line moved. Grady stayed at the east wall and watched them come in. He had been in the mess hall for hundreds of meal services. He understood the sound and rhythm of 380 men moving through a cafeteria-style line, the specific acoustic signature of that many trays and that many boots, and that many bodies navigating the same narrow corridor in sequence. He knew it the way you know a piece of music you've heard enough times, not consciously, but in the body as a set of expectations about what sound comes next and when. Tonight, the sound was different. It wasn't louder. It wasn't chaotic. If anything, it was quieter than usual, which was itself unusual, because 380 men moving through a space generally produced a baseline of conversation and incidental noise that the silence of the serving line would cut through but never entirely replace. Tonight there was almost no conversation. There was the shuffle of boots. There was the movement of trays. There was the particular sound of a large metal serving container being lifted and tilted, and then a sound that Grady had not heard in this room before, which was the sound of a solid portion of food landing on a metal tray with actual weight. The first man through the line stopped. Not for long, 3 seconds, maybe 4. He stood with his tray extended and looked at what had been placed on it, and then looked again. The way you look at something a second time, not because the first look failed to register, but because the first look registered something your brain is not yet prepared to accept as accurate. Then he stepped to the side and kept going, but he carried the tray differently than he had carried it into the line with both hands instead of one, and with his eyes still on it as he moved toward the tables. The second man through the line leaned forward as the server reached for the container. He watched the motion of the serving with the focused attention of someone trying to understand a mechanism following each movement, as if the sequence of actions held information that the result alone could not provide. When the portion landed on his tray, he inhaled once slowly through his nose, and then stepped away and turned his body halfway back toward the serving area before continuing toward the tables. Grady watched all of it. He watched the man who stood at the table's edge for a full 30 seconds before sitting down his tray in front of him, not eating, just looking at the food, with an expression that Grady couldn't name, but recognized as belonging to the category of human expressions that appear when a person encounters something they had decided without fully deciding it to stop expecting. He watched the man who picked up a piece of bread and turned it in his hands 3 times before setting it down, who then picked it up again and pressed it gently between his fingers, not to test its freshness, but for some other reason, some reason that had more to do with the hands than with the bread. He watched the young prisoner, the one from the corner seat at Vogel's table, the one who had said almost nothing to anyone, in 6 months sit down with his tray and place both palms flat on the table on either side of it and look at the food with an expression of such complete stillness that it was almost alarming, the stillness. Not of a man at peace, but of a man who has been moving for so long that stopping has temporarily confused all his systems. He watched Heinrich Vogel come through the line, last or nearly last, having waited at the back of the queue until the majority of the men had passed through. Vogel collected his tray with the same deliberate care he brought to everything and walked to his table and sat down and arranged his utensils and then sat for a moment before eating, not praying exactly, but something adjacent to it, the gesture of a man marking a moment before he moves through it. Grady watched all of this and felt something he could not locate clearly, something that had started as observation and had crossed without his permission into something more personal. He was not hungry. He had eaten in the guard mess at 5:30. But he stood at the east wall of the mess hall and watched 380 men discover that tonight was different and felt something tight in his chest that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with a need he couldn't name precisely. He was in the middle of this uncompleted thought when Chet appeared at his shoulder. "We've got something," Chet said. His voice was low and without the usual commentary energy, which meant it was official rather than conversational. "What kind of something?" Grady said. Chet tilted his head toward the far end of the mess hall near the serving area exit corridor. "Someone flagged it, one of the prisoners coming in from the farm detail this afternoon. They think he's carrying something from lunch." Grady looked. At the end of the corridor, one of the other guards, a man named Fredericks, was standing with a prisoner who was not looking at anyone. He was a man of about 40, broad-shouldered in the way of someone who had been broader before, with a face that had the flat quality of someone managing their own expression very carefully. Protocol was clear. Any prisoner suspected of removing food from the serving area for unauthorized storage or transfer was to be identified, questioned, and the violation documented. It was not a severe infraction, but it was an infraction, and the documentation was mandatory. Grady walked across the room. He was aware, as he walked, of the meal continuing around him, of 380 men eating real food for the first time in however long it had been, of the quality of sound in the room which had shifted from the silence of anticipation into something more continuous, the sound of people eating in earnest with the particular rhythm that comes when doubt has been set aside and the body has taken over from the calculating mind. He reached Fredericks and the prisoner. "What have we got?" Grady said. Fredericks nodded at the prisoner's jacket. He was coming through the secondary check at the corridor. "There's something in the lining of the left side." He didn't resist the check, he's got something. Grady looked at the prisoner. The man was looking at a point on the wall approximately 2 feet to Grady's left. He had positioned his hands at his sides in the way of someone who has decided that their hands are the part of themselves most likely to say something they haven't authorized, and has therefore placed them somewhere they can be observed and controlled. Grady said in the German he'd learned enough of from the Army's basic language training to manage the operational necessities. "Empty your jacket pocket. Left side." The man reached into the lining of his jacket and removed what was there without hesitation. He placed it on the corridor ledge with the specific care of someone setting down something fragile. It was a piece of bread, dry, wrapped in a strip of cloth torn from something, no larger than a man's palm. Grady looked at it. He looked at the prisoner. He looked at the bread again. "This wasn't from tonight," Grady said. "This is from lunch." The man said nothing. Grady said, "Why do you have this?" The man looked at the wall. Then he said something in German quietly. Grady caught most of it. He was a man from the West Barracks. His bunkmate was sick, fever since yesterday. The sick man had not been able to come to lunch and had not been brought a tray because the tray delivery for sick prisoners ran on the medical request system, and the medical request had been filed but not yet processed. The bread was for the bunkmate. He had intended to bring it back before the dinner bell, and had not managed it in time. He said all of this to the wall, not to Grady, to the wall in the tone of someone providing a factual account without requesting anything in connection with that account. Grady stood with the piece of bread on the ledge in front of him and the prisoner looking at the wall and the dinner continuing on the other side of the corridor, and the thing that was happening in his chest happening with more pressure than before. The regulation was not complicated. Removal of food from the serving area, documentation required. Potential restriction of canteen privileges pending review. It was not a severe consequence, but it was a consequence, and the documentation was mandatory. And Grady knew how to do it, and the paperwork was in the duty station, and it would take him 12 minutes. He picked up the bread. He held it for a moment. He looked at the prisoner, who was still looking at the wall. Then he looked at Fredericks and said, "I've got this. You can return to your post." Fredericks looked uncertain for a moment and then nodded and walked back toward the main floor. Grady held the bread and looked at the prisoner. He thought about what the regulations said. He thought about what Gaines had said because "it's the right thing to do tonight," said in the voice of a man who had decided what right meant and had organized the evening around it. He thought about Robert, not a specific thought, not a memory with edges and sequence. Just Robert present in the way that people are present when you're standing at a decision point and they knew you well enough to know which way you were going to go before you did. Grady reached behind the corridor ledge and opened the document case that was mounted there for duty log entries during meal service. He took out the form. He filled in the date and his name and his post assignment. He wrote a brief account of the observation and the nature of the item. He noted that the prisoner had cooperated with the secondary check and had provided an account of the item's purpose. He wrote that the matter had been reviewed and the item had been confiscated. He put the form in the duty log. He put the bread in his jacket pocket. He went back to the east wall. He stood there for the remainder of the meal service and watched 380 men eat and felt the bread in his jacket pocket pressing against his ribs on the right side while Robert's letter pressed against his ribs on the left, and he understood that he had done exactly the right thing and exactly the wrong thing at the same moment, and that the fact of these two things being simultaneously true was going to require more thinking than he had available to him right now standing at the east wall at Camp Harlow on a Tuesday in May. The meal took 90 minutes, not because the food required 90 minutes to consume, because the men eating it required 90 minutes. Because there was a difference between eating and the particular thing that was happening in this room tonight, which included eating but also included something slower, something that had to do with the pace at which a human being allows themselves to believe that something good is real when they have been trained by experience to assume that good things are temporary and the bill for them is always coming. Grady watched the rhythm of the room change as the meal progressed, the early caution giving way to something more continuous. Spoons moving with less hesitation, hands reaching for bread with less deliberation, the sound of the room deepening into the sound of people eating in earnest, without performance, without commentary, simply taking in something the body had been waiting for. He watched the young prisoner at Vogel's table eat half of what was on his tray and then stop. Not because he was finished. He stopped the way you stop when the thing you've been given is more than you knew how to want, and the gap between what you'd stopped expecting and what was in front of you has become temporarily too wide to move across. He sat with his hands flat on the table and looked at the tray and did not look up. Vogel put his hand on the young man's shoulder. He left it there for a moment. That was all. Grady was filling out his end-of-service count sheet when he became aware that someone was standing near him, not in the general proximity way that happened throughout meal service, but with the specific intentionality of someone who had walked to this particular spot for a reason. He looked up. Heinrich Vogel was standing 6 feet away, not looking at Grady, looking at the emptying room, at the men carrying their trays back to the clearing station, at the particular winding down of a meal service that had been different from every other meal service in Camp Harlow's existence. He had the expression of a man who had attended to something for a long time and was now watching it conclude. Grady waited. Vogel turned to look at him. He said in English that was unhurried and grammatically exact in the way of someone who had learned the language from books before he had learned it from speaking, "The man you reported this evening. Before the war, he was a teacher in a village outside Bremen. He taught children to read." He said it quietly, without accusation, without the rhetorical shape of an argument. He delivered it the way a physician delivers a piece of information the patient needs to have clearly and without editorializing, because the information itself is the point, and dressing it up would be a disservice to both parties. Then he walked away, toward the door, toward the evening compound, without looking back. Grady stood at the east wall and did not move for a moment. He looked at the duty log in his hand, at the form he had filled in, at the word confiscated and the 3 lines of careful documentation underneath it. He thought about a school teacher from a village outside Bremen wrapping a piece of bread in a strip of cloth to carry back to a sick man who hadn't eaten since yesterday. He thought about the bread in his right jacket pocket. He thought about what Vogel had said and the way he'd said it without requesting anything, without suggesting any response, or as if the information were simply a fact about the world that Grady deserved to have, and what Grady did with it was entirely Grady's business. The mess hall cleared. Grady helped with the end-of-service count and the tray collection and the standard post-meal procedure that happened the same way every night, regardless of what the meal had been, because procedure did not adjust itself for significance. He moved through it without being fully present in it, the way you move through familiar physical tasks when the part of your mind that handles conscious attention is occupied with something else. He was crossing the compound toward the guard quarters at 8:15 when Chet fell into step beside him. "Can I tell you something?" Chet said. "You're going to tell me, regardless," Grady said. "Fair," Chet said. "So I was in the supply office this afternoon right after the rotation because Henderson wanted me to sign off on the fuel invoice for the truck maintenance. And I'm in there, and Gaines's administrative file is on the desk because Corporal Sims had been pulling something for him and hadn't put it back yet." Grady walked. "And I wasn't trying to look at it," Chet said. "I genuinely wasn't. But the top sheet was a receipt, a payment receipt from the Hutchinson Meat Company over in Reno County. And the name on the account wasn't the camp. It wasn't the Army. It was a personal account. Harlan J. Gaines." Grady slowed without stopping. "He bought it himself," Chet said. "The meat. I'm guessing the produce too, and probably the bread, though I only saw the one receipt. He paid out of his own pocket. For 380 prisoners and the full guard contingent. Do you have any idea what that costs?" Grady said nothing. "That's got to be, I don't know, 3 months' pay for a captain," Chet said. "Maybe more. He's a single man, no dependents. He's been posted here for 2 years, so he's not spending on rent. But still, that's not nothing. That's a decision. That's a real decision that costs something." They walked in silence for a moment. "Why," Chet said, "why does a man do that? On a Tuesday, with no inspection coming and no occasion and nobody from regional coming to see it?" Grady looked up at the Kansas sky. The last of the evening color was leaving the west horizon, the flat land absorbing the dark the way it absorbed everything gradually and without drama. The first stars were becoming visible in the east, the way they always were, the way they had been every night, for every night that Grady had been at Camp Harlow, and every night before that, indifferent to the specific texture of the day below them. He thought about Gaines on the telephone at 10:40 that morning. "Not yet. Let me do this first." He thought about 380 men eating real food before they heard news they didn't yet know was coming. He thought about what it meant to understand that some information required preparation, that there was a difference between telling people something and giving people a moment that made them ready to be people first and statistics second. He was beginning to understand what kind of man Harlan Gaines was. "I don't know," Grady said. He did know. He just wasn't ready to say it yet. Chet peeled off toward the East Guard quarters. Grady kept walking. He walked past the guard quarters and past the motor pool, and around the back of the maintenance shed to the edge of the inner fence where the perimeter light from the nearest tower fell in a wide, pale column on the gravel and left the spaces between the columns in a darkness that was close to complete. He put his hand in his right jacket pocket. He took out the piece of bread. It was wrapped in its strip of cloth, and it was slightly warm from being in his pocket for the past 2 hours, which was a strange thing to notice that warmth, the residual heat of a man's body transferred to a piece of bread through a jacket pocket over 2 hours on a May evening in Kansas. He looked at it in the column of perimeter light. He thought about the school teacher from Bremen who had carried it in his jacket from lunch, who had been careful with it, who had wrapped it in cloth so it wouldn't crumble, who had intended to get back to the barracks before the dinner bell and hadn't managed it for whatever reason, for whatever small failure of timing that had put him in the secondary check corridor with a piece of bread in his jacket lining, while 380 other men were discovering that tonight was different. He stood there for a while. The compound was settling into its evening sounds, the distant conversation from the guard quarters, the occasional movement from the barracks where the lights-out sequence was beginning. The wind from the west that was always there, the Kansas wind that didn't stop for anything, and treated the fence wire and the guard towers and the 380 men sleeping inside it all with the same complete indifference. Grady put the bread back in his pocket. He stood for another moment with his hand still in his pocket and the bread warm in his palm and the letter in his left breast pocket in the duty log form with the word confiscated on it back at the East Wall station where he'd left it. He was 24 years old and he had not been in the war, and his brother had died in mud outside Cologne on March 22nd, and he had agreed to a transfer that his mother had requested, and he had been telling himself for 47 days that the agreement had been entirely for her, and he had been lying to himself for at least 40 of those 47 days, and he knew it. Robert had known it too, probably. That it was the thing about Robert. He had been the kind of person who knew things about you without making a demonstration of knowing them, who held what he knew lightly and without leverage, who extended to you the grace of not being confronted with your own truths until you were ready to look at them. Grady had not been ready to look at any of this. He was not sure he was ready now, but he was starting to understand that ready and necessary were not always the same thing, and that sometimes the thing you needed to do arrived before the version of yourself who was prepared to do it. He looked up at the stars. He thought about the bread in his pocket and what he was going to do with it, which he already knew he had known. Since Vogel walked away from the east wall, he had just needed the 2 hours of walking and the conversation with Chet and the column of perimeter light to get himself to the place where he could admit that he knew. He thought about what Gaines had said in the office that morning, because it's the right thing to do, tonight. He thought about Vogel's hand on the young prisoner's shoulder, the bread on the young prisoner's tray, the schoolteacher from Bremen wrapping a piece of bread in cloth for a man who hadn't eaten since yesterday. He thought about what it looked like when people did small right things without an audience, what it looked like from the outside, what it had looked like from the east wall when he hadn't wanted to see it and had seen it anyway. He took his hand out of his pocket. He walked back toward the main compound. He had something to do before lights out, something that was not in the duty log and not in any procedure, and would not be documented by anyone, which was fine, which was exactly right, because some things were only worth doing if they didn't require documentation to make them real. Tomorrow he would figure out the rest. Tonight he just had to do this one thing. He walked toward the West Barracks. The West Barracks were the farthest from the administrative center, which was not an accident of design. Camp Harlow had been laid out by someone who understood that the relationship between authority and distance was not always proportional, that the men farthest from the offices were not necessarily the men who required the most supervision, but that the architecture of the camp would suggest otherwise, and suggestion had its own administrative utility. Grady had been to the West Barracks twice in 6 weeks, both times for count irregularities that had resolved themselves as clerical errors before he arrived. He knew the building the way he knew all the buildings from the outside, from the duty log entries, from the architectural sameness that Camp Harlow enforced across all its structures, as if uniformity were itself a kind of order. He walked there now without a flashlight because the perimeter lights gave him enough to navigate by, and because he did not want to be seen clearly, not by the tower guards who would note the movement and think nothing of it, but by the part of himself that was still conducting the argument about whether this was necessary. The argument had mostly concluded. He was walking toward the West Barracks. The conclusion was implicit in the walking. The door to the barracks was not locked after lights out. Locking the interior doors was not protocol at Camp Harlow because the fence was the security perimeter, and the interior was considered managed space, which meant Grady turned the handle and stepped inside without requiring any authorization except the authorization he had given himself, which was the only kind available for what he was doing. The barracks were dark except for the thin lines of perimeter light that came through the gaps in the window boards. Enough to see the rows of bunks. Enough to see the shapes of sleeping men or men performing sleep, which was a distinction impossible to make in the dark and which did not ultimately matter. He had the bunk number from the documentation. Third row, seventh bunk from the door lower. He walked quietly. He was aware of his boots on the floorboards, with a specificity he did not usually bring to walking, feeling for the soft spots, placing his weight gradually moving through the sleeping space of 100 men with the care of someone who understood that he was in a place he had not been invited, and that the men around him had not been given the choice of whether to be in this place at all. Third row, seventh bunk. The man in the lower seventh was lying on his side facing the wall. His breathing was audible in the way that a feverish person's breathing is audible, slightly effortful, with a quality of labor that normal sleep doesn't have. He was covered with the standard issue blanket and one additional, which meant someone had given him their extra, which was not a regulation practice, and which Grady noted without noting in any official capacity. Grady reached into his right jacket pocket. He took out the bread, still wrapped in its strip of cloth, still slightly warm. He placed it on the small shelf at the head of the bunk where the men kept their few permitted personal items. He placed it without a sound. He straightened up. The man in the bunk did not move. His breathing continued with its low, effortful quality, the rhythm of someone deep enough in fever sleep that the world was not reaching him cleanly. He did not know anyone had come in. He would not know when he woke who had left it. There was nothing to tell him. There was only the bread on the shelf where there had not been bread before, which was its own kind of message, complete without a signature. Grady walked back out of the West Barracks the way he had come in. He stood outside in the May night for a moment. The compound was quiet in the specific way it was quiet after lights out. Not silent, but settled the wind from the west, moving through the wire with its usual indifference. The tower lights making their slow patterns on the gravel, the shape of Camp Harlow, doing what it did every night, which was contain and wait and begin again in the morning. He did not feel relieved. He did not feel resolved. He felt the particular clarity that comes not from having solved something, but from having done the next right thing, when the next right thing became visible, which was a more modest feeling than resolution, but also more durable because it did not depend on outcomes. He walked back across the compound toward the mess hall. He was not sure why he walked toward the mess hall. The mess hall was closed. The meal service had been over for more than an hour. The cleaning detail had finished, and the building would be dark and empty, which was exactly why he walked toward it, because he needed somewhere that was dark and empty and did not require him to be any particular thing for anyone. The door was unlocked. He went in. The mess hall at night was a different building from the mess hall during service. The long tables were the same tables. The benches were the same benches. The windows were the same windows with the same evening light coming through them. But the absence of 380 men doing the things that 380 men did gave the space a quality of amplitude, as if the room had exhaled and was now much larger than its actual dimensions. The smell of the evening meal was still there, not strong, a residue. The particular warmth that cooked food leaves in a room present in the walls and the floor, and the air, the olfactory record of something that had happened here and was now finished. Grady sat down at the table nearest the east wall. His table, the table he'd stood beside all evening. He put his hands flat on the surface and looked at the room and let himself be in it without doing anything. He was sitting like that in the dark, in the smell of the finished meal, when he heard the door at the far end of the room open. He did not move. He watched. Heinrich Vogel came in. He was moving with the careful step of a man who expected the room to be empty and was proceeding accordingly, which meant he didn't see Grady immediately in the darkness near the east wall. He walked to the far end of the room to the table in the corner where he sat every meal and sat down. He placed his hands on the table. He sat with his back straight, facing the empty room, and was still. Grady watched him for a moment. Then he said quietly so as not to startle, "You couldn't sleep either." Vogel turned his head. He located Grady in the darkness without apparent surprise, which suggested either that he had better night vision than average, or that he was not a man who was easily surprised by things. He said, "I sleep less as I get older." He paused. "You are the guard from the east wall." Grady said Marsh. Grady Marsh. Vogel looked at him for a moment. Then he looked back at the empty room. Heinrich Vogel, he said, though Grady already knew this. It seemed to matter to Vogel to say it to establish that this conversation, whatever it was going to be, would happen between named people. They sat in the dark at opposite ends of the empty mess hall for a moment without speaking, which was not uncomfortable in the way that silence between strangers is usually uncomfortable. It had the quality of a pause in something rather than the absence of something. Grady said, "What you said tonight about the teacher." Vogel waited. "I heard you," Grady said. "I want you to know that." Vogel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I said it because it was true, not to make you feel a particular way about it." "I know," Grady said. Another pause. Grady said, "You speak English well. I learned it as a young man," Vogel said. "I believed it would be useful." He considered, "I did not anticipate the specific circumstances in which it would prove most useful." He said this without irony and without bitterness, which was itself a kind of accomplishment, and Grady recognized it as such. "What did you do?" Grady said. Before. Before, Vogel said, as if testing the word's weight. "I was a surgeon, general surgery, and then field surgery when the war required it." He paused. "Before the war, I had a practice in Freiburg, a house, a daughter who was studying music at the conservatory." He said this last part with the particular flatness of someone describing something they have learned to describe without the full weight of it, because carrying the full weight every time you mentioned it was not compatible with continuing to function. Grady said, "What instrument?" "Violin," Vogel said. He was quiet for a moment. "She plays well. She played well when I last heard her, which was 2 years ago. I assume she plays well still." Grady nodded. He thought about what it was to assume something about someone you loved, because the alternative to assuming was uncertainty, and uncertainty was not survivable in sustained doses. He thought about his mother in Wichita and the house on Clearwater Street going about the days without Robert in them. He thought about what she assumed, what she had to assume to get through the days. He said, "My brother, his name was Robert. He died in March." He had not said those words in that sequence to anyone since the telegram. He had said "my brother" to people who already knew. He had said Robert has gone to his mother in a phone call that he did not fully remember. He had not said his name was Robert. He died in March as a complete statement to a person who did not already know it. Vogel looked at him. He did not say "I'm sorry," which Grady had heard enough at times in the past 47 days, that the phrase had become nearly meaningless through repetition. He simply looked at him with the attention of someone who understood that a thing had been placed on the table, and the correct response to it was to regard it carefully rather than to quickly cover it with condolence. He said, "How old was he?" 27, Grady said. "He would have been 28 in July." Vogel nodded. "He was in France," Grady said. "And then Germany. He was near Cologne when it happened." He stopped. He looked at his hands on the table. "He taught me to drive," Grady said. He said this without planning to say it, without any clear sense of why this was the piece of information his mind produced from the full inventory of things he knew about Robert. But there it was. "He taught me how to drive. On this dirt road behind our house, I was 16. He let me steer, and then when I got it, he let me do the whole thing myself, and then he fell asleep in the passenger seat because he trusted me not to kill us. I thought he was faking it. Later, he told me he actually fell asleep, that he actually trusted me that much." Vogel was quiet. He let the story sit in the room the way the smell of the meal was sitting in the room, as something that belonged there, even though the thing that had produced it was finished. Grady said, "I wasn't there. I'm here instead of there." He had not said that to anyone either. Not in those words, not with the directness of "here" instead of "there," which was the most honest shape the thing had. Vogel said, "And you believe you should have been there?" Grady looked at the table. "My mother couldn't lose us both," he said. Vogel said, "That is true, and it is also not the same thing as what I asked." Grady felt something in his chest shift with the precision of a key in a lock, the specific feeling of a thing being moved by someone who knows exactly where it is. He said, "Yes, I believe I should have been there." The room held this. Vogel looked at the table for a moment. He looked at his hands. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket, the left breast pocket, the same place Grady kept Robert's letter, and took out something small and held it between his fingers for a moment before placing it on the table. He pushed it gently across the surface toward Grady. Grady looked at it. It was a military identification card, the kind issued to every American serviceman, laminated with the standard information and a photograph. It was worn at the edges, and there was a dark stain on one corner that Grady identified and then stopped identifying because some things your mind refuses to process directly and routes around instead. He looked at the photograph. He looked at the name, Robert James Marsh, Wichita, Kansas. The room did not change. The perimeter light still came through the window boards in its thin lines. The wind still moved through the wire outside. Grady's hands were still flat on the table, and Vogel was still sitting across from him, and the mess hall still smelled of the evening meal. None of these things changed, but the way Grady was inside the room changed completely. He looked at the card, he looked at Vogel, he looked at the card again. Vogel said, "I will tell you how I have this, and then whatever you want to do with that information, that is yours to decide." Grady waited. He could not speak. He was not sure he was breathing with the full capacity of his lungs. "The night of March 21st, Vogel said. We were near Cologne. I was with a group of soldiers who had been separated from the main column during the retreat. There was a farmhouse. We stopped there for the night because 3 of the men were wounded and could not continue." He paused, not for effect, for precision. He was a man who had spent his life in the practice of accurate description, and old habits did not abandon you even in mess halls in Kansas in the middle of the night. "There was a ditch," he said, "along the field to the east of the farmhouse. In the morning when the light came, we found an American soldier in that ditch. He was alive. He had been shot in the upper abdomen. Here he touched his own side briefly, and he had been there for some hours. He was in very poor condition." Grady held perfectly still. "I had instruments with me," Vogel said. "Not proper surgical instruments. Field instruments. A kit that was meant for stabilization rather than repair. There was no anesthetic. There was no light except what we made." He paused. "I operated on him in that ditch in the dark with what I had. The hemorrhage was controlled. It took approximately 2 hours." He looked at the table. "He was conscious for some of it," Vogel said. "Not all. When he was conscious, he did not make sounds that I would have expected a man in his condition to make. He considered the word very determined. I don't know a better word for it. He seemed to have decided that making this easy for me was more important than what he was experiencing, which is not a decision most people make in those circumstances." Grady's eyes were burning. He did not blink. When it was finished, Vogel said, "And the bleeding had stopped, and he was stable," I told him, in English, "that he would live through the night, that his body could repair itself from this point if he allowed it." He looked at me for a moment, and then he said something. He said, "How do you know that?" Not aggressively, with what I thought was genuine curiosity, as if he was interested in the methodology. Vogel almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but the edges of something that had been a smile once and still knew how to approach that shape. "I told him I was a surgeon," Vogel said. He said, "No kidding." He said it in a way that I found even then, even in those circumstances, I found it very human. Very specifically human. Grady pressed his lips together. "Before we were separated in the morning, Vogel said he gave me his identification card. He said, 'So you will know my name.' He said, 'In case we meet again.' I took it because I understood that he meant it sincerely, that it was an offer of continuity, of the possibility that something might connect this moment to some future moment where we would both exist in better circumstances." He paused. "I kept it because I was not able to leave it in that ditch. I was not able to leave it as if it had not happened." He looked at Grady. "Dad, I did not know he died the next day," Vogel said. "I did not know this until you said near Cologne, and then I began to know." He was quiet. He was alive when I last saw him. His color had returned. He was speaking. He was, I believed, going to be all right. Grady looked at the identification card on the table. He thought about Robert on the morning of March 22nd. Stabilized. Color returned. Breathing with his full lungs. Getting up from a ditch in a field near Cologne because he was Robert James Marsh from Wichita, Kansas, and Robert James Marsh got up. Robert James Marsh had never in his life stayed down when there was a reason to get up. And then something else had happened. Some other thing on that same day in that same terrain that the sergeant's letter had described in careful language and that Grady had read once and would probably read in his dreams for the rest of his life. He reached out and picked up the identification card. He held it with both hands. He looked at Robert's photograph. The photograph that had been taken before the war, before France, before Germany, before the ditch in the field near Cologne. Robert, at 25, looking at the camera with the expression of a man who was cooperating with an administrative requirement and did not have strong feelings about photographs. Grady said, "He was alive because of you." He said it quietly. Not as a question, not as an accusation, as a fact that he needed to speak out loud to make fully real the way some facts require the act of speaking to become things you can actually hold. Vogel said nothing. He waited. Grady said he got 6 more weeks. After that night, he got 6 more weeks because of what you did in that ditch in the dark. He thought about what 6 weeks had contained. He thought about the letter in his left breast pocket postmarked March 19th, which was before the ditch, which meant there was another letter. There might be another letter written in the weeks between the ditch and March 22nd, a letter that had not arrived or that had been lost in the postal chaos of an advancing front line, a letter he would never read that Robert had written from the other side of a night in a ditch in a field near Cologne. He thought about what Robert might have said in that letter. He thought about what Robert knew having come through that night, having made the decision to be easy on a German surgeon in a ditch at 3 in the morning, because it was the right thing to do, the next right thing when the next right thing presented itself. He understood something then that he had not understood before, not clearly, not in words. He understood that Robert had not been afraid because Robert had already made his peace with what things were worth out there when everything was simplified down to essential questions. Robert had written about this in the letter in Grady's breast pocket. He had said he wanted to tell Grady about his conclusions in person over something resembling a decent meal. He had not gotten the meal, but he had made the conclusions, and he had carried them into the morning of March 22nd, and whatever came after, and the carrying was the whole thing, and Grady had been holding the letter for 47 days without letting himself read it because reading it meant accepting that Robert was not coming to tell him the conclusions in person, that the letter was all there was, and the letter was enough. The letter was everything. The letter had been waiting in his breast pocket for 47 days to be enough. He heard the door at the far end of the mess hall open. He looked up. Captain Harlan Gaines stood in the doorway. He was still in his uniform, which meant he had not yet been to bed, which meant whatever he had been waiting to do, he had been waiting in his office, watching the evening conclude, monitoring the moment until he judged it correct. He looked at Grady and at Vogel and at the table between them, at the identification card in Grady's hands, and his expression did not change, which meant that nothing about this scene surprised him, which itself was a piece of information. He walked across the mess hall. He pulled out the bench across from Grady and sat down. He placed on the table in front of him a single sheet of paper, a telegraph transcription, the standard military format with the header information and the date and the time of receipt. He placed it on the table and left his hand on it for a moment. Then he slid it toward Grady. The date on the header was May 8th, 1945. The time of receipt was 0612. 6:12 in the morning. 14 hours ago. The message was 3 words. Germany has surrendered. Grady looked at the paper. He looked at the time of receipt. He looked at Gaines. Gaines said, I received it at 6 this morning. I have been in contact with the regional office throughout the day regarding the official notification procedure for the camp population. He said this carefully with the measured delivery of a man reading from a prepared statement while simultaneously setting that statement alongside something more personal. The official notification will be made tomorrow morning at assembly, Gaines said, with the full protocol, flags, the formal language, the whole procedure. He looked at the table. He said I needed to do this first, before the notification, before they became the end of something rather than the beginning of something. He paused. Before they were the numbers in the announcement rather than the men in the mess hall. Grady looked at Gaines. At this 59-year-old man who had spent 3 decades in the Army and had understood this morning at 6:12 that the right response to the end of a war was to feed people first, to make them human first, to give them a meal that cost 3 months of a captain's salary and required no documentation and would appear in no official record because it had nothing to do with official records and everything to do with what you owed to people when you had authority over them. He thought about the bread in the West Barracks on the shelf by the sick man's bunk. He thought about Vogel's hand on the young prisoner's shoulder. He thought about a surgeon in a ditch near Cologne in the dark with inadequate instruments and no anesthetic spending 2 hours keeping a man alive because the man was there and the alternative was not something the surgeon was able to choose. He thought about the next right thing, about how it presented itself and what it caught on and why people did it anyway. The ones who did, the ones who had decided without quite deciding that this was the standard they were holding themselves to, regardless of the audience. Gaines looked at the identification card in Grady's hands. He looked at Vogel, he looked at Grady, he did not ask. He understood in the way that men who have seen enough of the world understand things by the shape of what was in front of him, rather than by its explicit content. He stood up. He left the telegraph transcription on the table. He said to Vogel quietly and directly, with none of the layered authority of the commanding officer, your daughter, the one who plays violin. When this is processed through the repatriation system, I will make sure your file has a priority notation. It won't change the timeline significantly, but it will make sure your case isn't sitting at the bottom of a stack. Vogel looked at him. He looked at him for a long moment with the expression of a man who has learned through experience to be careful about accepting things and who is currently deciding whether this is the kind of thing to be careful about. He said, "Thank you." Gaines nodded once. He walked back across the mess hall and out through the far door, and the room settled back into its amplified quiet larger than its actual dimensions, holding the residue of everything that had happened in it and everything that had just happened in it. Grady sat with the identification card in his hands and the telegraph transcription on the table, and Vogel across from him and the Kansas night outside the windows. He set the identification card down on the table, between himself and Vogel, equidistant in the space between two men. He said, "My brother lived through that night because of what you did." Vogel looked at the card. He said, "I did not know his name until you said it tonight. In all this time, I knew his face. I knew his voice. I did not know his name." He looked at Grady. "Now I know his name," he said. Grady nodded. He reached into his left brace pocket and unbuttoned it. He took out the letter. He set it on the table. He looked at it for a moment at Robert's handwriting on the envelope at the Wichita address in the return corner at the postmark from March 19th, 3 days before the ditch. 3 days before Vogel's hands in the dark had extended Robert's life by 6 weeks. He opened the letter. He read it. He read it the way he should have read it 47 days ago, which was slowly, which was with his full attention, which was without the protective distance of a man who is afraid of what a piece of paper might do to him. He read it as if Robert were sitting across from him, which was not possible, and as if this were the meal Robert had wanted them to have together, which was not exactly what it was, and also somehow exactly what it was. He read the part about the countryside which he had remembered. He read the part about the cold. He read the part near the end, the part he had not been able to look at directly about what things were worth and what the essential questions simplified down to. Robert had written in his usual handwriting, without drama, "The things worth keeping are the things you do without an audience. Everything else is just performance. I think I've always known this. I just had to come out here to be certain." That was the conclusion. That was what Robert had wanted to tell him over something resembling a decent meal. The things worth keeping are the things you do without an audience. Grady sat with this for a moment. He thought about Vogel in the ditch, the bread on the young prisoner's tray, Gaines at the telephone at 6:12 in the morning, deciding to feed people before he told them the war was over, the bread on the shelf in the West Barracks. The 12 minutes Grady had not spent filing a complete report. He thought about his mother on Clearwater Street, who had written a letter to protect her remaining son, and who had been right to write it, who had not been wrong about any of it, and who was going to need her remaining son to come home without the weight he had been carrying, because carrying it was not what Robert would have wanted him to do with the extra time that a German surgeon in a ditch had made possible. He folded the letter carefully. He put it back in the envelope. He put the envelope in his left breast pocket and buttoned it. Then he stood up. He picked up the identification card from the table. He held it for a moment, feeling its weight, which was almost no weight at all, and also the specific weight of everything it had been through and everywhere it had been. He placed it back on the table, in front of Vogel. Vogel looked at it. He looked at Grady. Grady said, "Keep it." He kept it with him all those weeks after the ditch. He gave it to you because he wanted a connection to carry forward. That's still what it is. Vogel did not move immediately. He looked at the Kerdintere, then he picked it up and held it in his hands and nodded once slowly, the particular nod of a man receiving something he intends to be careful with. Grady said, "I'm glad he wasn't alone. In that ditch, I'm glad someone was there." He picked up Gaines's telegraph transcription from the table and folded it once and put it in his right jacket pocket, the pocket that had been carrying the bread until an hour ago and was now empty. He walked to the mess hall door. He stopped with his hand on it. He said without turning around, "I'll make sure the medical request for your bunkmate in West Barracks is processed first thing in the morning. The man who was sick, he'll have a tray at breakfast." He went out into the Kansas night. He stood on the step outside the mess hall and looked up at the stars. The same stars that were always there, the same indifferent arrangement of light and distance that had been above Camp Harlow every night and would be above it tomorrow and for every night after that, whether the war was over or not, whether 380 men knew it or not, whether Grady Marsh was 24 years old and learning something in a mess hall in the dark, or was something else entirely in some future year he couldn't see yet. The wind came from the west. He stood in it for a while. Then he went to the guard quarters and sat on his bunk and took out Robert's letter again and read it a second time, which he had not been able to do 47 days ago, and could do now and then a third time, which took him until nearly 2 in the morning. After the third time, he turned on the small desk lamp and found paper and a pen in the drawer where he kept his duty materials. He wrote a date at the top, May 9th, 1945, 1 in the morning. He wrote his mother's name and her address on Clearwater Street in Wichita, Kansas, which was 212 miles from Camp Harlow, and also the only place in the world that contained the people he needed to tell this to. He held the pen for a moment. Then he wrote, "Mom, I met someone who knew Robert." He said Robert wasn't afraid. He sat with that sentence for a moment, feeling its weight, which was not no weight at all, which was the weight of something that had traveled a very long way to arrive where it needed to be. Then he kept writing. He wrote for a long time in the quiet of the guard quarters, with the Kansas night outside and the stars still there, and the wind still coming from the west, until he had said everything he needed to say, which was more than he had expected and exactly as much as was required. In the morning, Camp Harlow would learn that the war was over. In the morning, 380 men would hear the official language and the formal procedure and the announcement that something enormous had finished. But right now, it was still the middle of the night, and Grady Marsh was writing a letter, and the bread was on the shelf in the West Barracks, and Heinrich Vogel was sitting in the empty mess hall with an identification card in his hands. And Harlan Gaines was in his office watching the compound through his window, and the Kansas sky was full of stars that didn't know anything about any of it and shone anyway. And somewhere in all of that, in the space between what had been lost and what had been found, and what had been done without an audience, in the dark, on an ordinary Tuesday in May, something was continuing. That was not the war and was not the camp and was not the 47 days of weight in a breast pocket. Something that had been carried across a long distance by people who understood each in their own way, that the carrying was the point. That was still the point. That would always be the point.